Perfect. Okay, so I'm Narinda Multani, account manager here at the Thames Valley Chamber of Commerce. My member Jon Atkins of Jon Atkins Associates will be delivering today's webinar, which is being recorded and is available to listen to again via the Chamber webinar library. So you just need to go into the Chamber website, which I will share with you towards the end, and you can just then select the webinar library and listen to this webinar again, and also share the link amongst your network. So if you have any questions for Jon, please post them in the chat box, and Jon will answer those for you as he goes along. So thank you, and over to you, Jon.
Thank you very much indeed. So, a warm welcome to you all. Good morning, or good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you're listening to this. Thanks, Narinda, for the warm welcome. My name's Jon Atkins. I'm a business psychologist, and I've spent the last 15 years working with organisations, large and small, across numerous different industries and sectors, helping them to drive their diversity and inclusion agenda. Obviously, it's an area that I have a deep professional interest in. But also for me, it's a personal passion about making organisations a happy place to be, making people who work for organisations to be as happy, to be as productive, to be as efficient as they possibly can be. And certainly around the diversity and inclusion piece, this has a real personal impact on me. To share a personal story just to kick things off. So I've got two young children. My son, several years ago, had a real interest. He was really into Frozen, the Disney movie. I'm sure you all remember it. And he asked Santa Claus one Christmas for a Frozen lunchbox, which Santa duly delivered. And he was really excited about taking that to school on his first day back after the Christmas break. And after a couple of days, he came back, and he was upset. You could tell he was upset. Something had gone wrong. We had a little chat about what was going on. And it turns out that some of the boys in his class were gently, and I stress the word gently, teasing him about the fact that he was carrying around with him a girl's lunchbox. It was for girls. He shouldn't be carrying it. He's a boy. It was for girls, okay? And obviously he was deeply upset about this. I mean, he never used it again. And it was, you could see a little part of his soul being destroyed by it. But for me, I suppose, given my professional expertise, it was also a stark illustration of how early we become indoctrinated in ways of thinking and ways of thinking about other groups in society, how we quickly develop stereotypical views about, for example, in this case, who boys are and how they should be, and who girls are and how they should be. That boys like blue and should play with army toys and footballs, and girls should like pink and play with kitchen utensils and dolls. You know, from a very, very early age, we're indoctrinated into these rough rules of thumb, these mental models that are designed to help us navigate the world around us. But of course, simultaneously, they just railroad us. They just channel us down a particular path, and we lose sight. We lose sight of what makes an individual truly an individual. And we run the risk of just seeing them for the labels we hang around their neck. And that is something I see time and time again in organizations that I work with. There is a strong desire to drive diversity and inclusion in those organizations, but simultaneously a lack of recognition that there are some significant social forces that are stopping us from doing that successfully. A little bit about me. So as Narinda said, I'm a business psychologist by background. What I do is I use an understanding of how people think, how people interact, how people behave with one another to effectively make people happier, more productive, more efficient at work, and by extension, to make the organizations themselves more successful. Obviously, that's a picture of me pre-COVID with actually having some hair, so bear with me on that one. But fundamentally, my job is to make organizations more successful through the power of their people. And what I want to do with you today is very simply give you a little illustration as to what we mean by diversity and inclusion. Diversity and inclusion is a hugely important topic. And I'm sure you'd agree with what's going on around the world at the moment, that it is an area that is very much high on people's agendas. Now, obviously, I've been working in it for 15 odd years now, and I've always been trying to push it up the agenda. But there still languishes a little misunderstanding about what we mean by diversity and inclusion more generally, why it matters to organizations. So we'll be looking to address that key question. I also simultaneously want to bring in some of the psychology behind all of this. What do we mean by bias? Where does it come from? What impact does it have on our day-to-day lives? And particularly focusing on arguably some of the more subtle, unconscious forms of bias that we bring in to any situation. And perhaps most importantly, raising your awareness of unconscious bias is unlikely to lead to any significant change. What we need to do is to think about, well, what do we do to combat that? What do we do to manage the risks associated with our bias? What do we do to mitigate the risks associated with our biases? So I'd like to offer you a few simple strategies that each and every one of you can take away today and start implementing in the work that you do on a day-to-day basis. As Narinder said, if you've got any thoughts or questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat screen. Narinder's monitoring that, so if there are any particularly pertinent questions, then she may interrupt me and we'll try to address them. But simultaneously, I'll try and make sure that we squeeze in some time right towards the very end to address any particular points or views or issues that you may have. So I welcome open discussion, I really do. I mean, if there are things you agree with, great. If there are things you disagree with, challenge me on them. I think anything to do with diversity and inclusion starts with having a really meaningful, open, constructive conversation about what we're talking about. So feel free to contribute. Okay, so let's dive in. Let's start with, well, I was going to say some of the basics, but let's start at the beginning. Equality, diversity, and inclusion. These are three terms that are thrown around an awful lot in organizations, increasingly so over the last few months. In my experience, however, these are three terms that are still, to this day, often confused or misunderstood. So it is useful to get to grips with what we're talking about here. Now, of course, there might be a variety of different definitions for each of these, but the ones that work for me particularly, when we talk about equality, broadly speaking, we're talking about living up to our legal obligations towards fairness. We're talking about, here in the UK, for example, equality legislation that affords people legal protection against discrimination based on particular characteristics or qualities that they hold. It's a hugely important step forward, of course it is, because it provides that opportunity for legal recourse should it be needed. But if we're going to be cynical about it, it's also the bare minimum that we need to do to avoid getting ourselves into legal hot water. It's very reactive in nature, it's very defensive in nature. Whereas diversity as a concept builds on top of equality by recognizing in a much more positive, much more proactive way that difference in an organization is an asset. It's a benefit, okay? It's a huge source of opportunity. It broadens our thinking beyond those legally protected characteristics of gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, and so on, to build into that concept literally everything that makes us different. You think about things like personality, work style, socioeconomic background. These are characteristics that make us the individuals that we are, not legally protected, but huge sources of difference that we bring into any workplace situation. So diversity is about difference. But you can have an organization that is diverse. It doesn't necessarily make for one that is inclusive. An organization that values that difference, that makes the most of that difference, that enables people to be their authentic selves, that enables people to share their viewpoint, express their ideas, and those ideas are valued. That's what we mean when we talk about inclusion. We're talking about creating an environment where everyone has the opportunity to make the most of their skills, their experience, and their potential. So yeah, of course, we have to live up to our legal obligations, undoubtedly. But simultaneously, we also need to think about, well, what are we doing to actually attract difference, attract diversity of talent, background, experience, and so on to our organizations, and simultaneously create a culture that welcomes that difference once you have it. And the reason why this is important is well-founded. There is literally 50 years worth of research attesting to one simple fact: diverse and inclusive organizations are better than those that aren't. It's that simple. whether you want to look at it through the lens of attracting top talent and building that sense of engagement in the organization, which in turn simultaneously obviously drives that sense of innovation. And many organizations, most organizations, would readily admit to the fact that it is innovation and creativity that drives their competitive success. It's what enables them to meet their increasingly diverse customer base and reflect society at large, which simultaneously obviously anchors itself to things like improved business performance. Some of you may be familiar with an influential Mckinsey report. They repeat it every 2 or 3 years. And the most recent iteration late last year, early this year, actually put some figures to this. And they've shown that, for example, organizations that are in what they call the top quartile for gender representation will outperform or have a 25% increased chance of outperforming the profitability levels of those in the bottom quartile in terms of gender representation. You supplement that in terms of ethnicity and ethnic minority representation in the organization, and you can see a 36% increased likelihood that you will achieve above profitability compared to those in the bottom quartile. So it matters. It matters from a business point of view. Now, personally, I just believe it's the right thing to do. I'm sure each and every one of you wants to work for an organization in which you feel valued and respected for who you are, that you feel part of what's going on, that you can be your true self, and that true self is valued and listened to. And I'm sure you'd want to create that for everybody else. So above all, it's just the right thing to do. But whatever lens you want to look at it through, diversity and inclusion matters. It is business critical to success. Which therefore begs one particularly obvious and stark question for me, which is why, after 50 years worth of research showing that diversity and inclusion is fundamentally important, do I still have a job? Why am I still talking to people like you on a daily basis about diversity and inclusion and driving that inclusion agenda forward? Well, one of the reasons, and I do stress one of the reasons for this, is that we until recently have done very little to look at, sorry, I need to go back a slide. What we need to think about and what we need to look at is perhaps one of the weakest links in this whole process, which is us as human beings, our inherent biases that we carry around with us. The fact that what makes us human are also the very things that can lead us off down the wrong path, that subconsciously we end up in a space we never consciously intended to be in. And this is where I want to bring in some of the psychology behind this, to explore how we think and how we really think. To give you an illustration of what we mean by unconscious bias and where it comes from. Oh, hello, Narinda.
Hi there. Okay, so we're getting some responses in the chat box. So I believe it's Dr. Gopal Singh. He's saying, can equity rather than equality, is it unity in diversity? So that's what he stated.
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. I mean, there are lots of terms. I think equity is an important term. It is one of those misunderstandings, I think, in this space, is that when we talk about diversity and inclusion, when we throw words around like equality, what we're talking about is treating everybody exactly the same. And that is not the point. That is absolutely not the point. It's about recognizing difference within an individual, difference within a population, recognizing that those differences might therefore necessitate from us different levels of support or intervention. And that is what equity is about. It's about recognizing, acknowledging, embracing those differences and realizing, for example, that certain populations might need different levels of support to enable them to achieve great success. Okay, so that I think is very much. The word unity, yes, absolutely. I mean, inclusion is sometimes supplemented with words like unity, sometimes supplemented with words like belonging. So there are multiple different definitions, and as I'm sure you'd expect, we're unlikely to have a universally accepted definition, because as with language more generally, it evolves over time. But for now, equality, diversity, and inclusion, in my experience, tends to be the language of choice in many organisations. But as I said, there still lingers this misunderstanding of what we're talking about.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, John. So Marco Miranda has also posed a question. There are organisations that can't do anything without asking Mckinsey whether to go left or right. So why do organisations appear to ignore Mckinsey when they talk about the value of diversity?
I'm sorry, Narendra, I'm not sure I understand the question. The McKinsey report.
Mckinsey.
Yeah, could you
so there are organisations that can't do anything without asking Mckinsey whether to go left or right. Or why do organisations appear to ignore Mckinsey when they talk about the value of diversity?
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think my perspective on this is where organisations fail around diversity and inclusion, fail to take action, is on a number of different levels. One is that they're afraid to go there in the first place, that they are afraid to open Pandora's box and have a look at what's inside. One of the fundamental principles about anything in this space is that you have to open that box. You have to listen to and engage with your employees. I mean, it's something that is talked about very widely in response to the very important Black Lives Matter movement at the moment, is that a starting point is listening and learning. So one of the reasons I think many organizations fail to do anything at all is because they're afraid, they're scared. However, being scared doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, okay? Because there are issues in your organization. Absolutely, undoubtedly, without fail, there will be issues where diversity and inclusion is not living up to what it needs to be. And until you embrace them, you'll never know. The second failure I see actually is where, coming back to the definitions of diversity and inclusion, that diversity is seen as a tick box exercise, and more importantly, it's all about the numbers. Once we increase, for example, the numbers of female talent at top levels in the organization, we can sit back and relax. You can't. It frustrates me so much when a client will turn around to me and say, okay, John, when is this all finished? You know, when do we know we've done and we've achieved it and we can go back and get on with our lives? You can't. Society evolves and organizations continue to evolve. So it is a journey that doesn't have an end, but it is a journey that absolutely has to be started.
Okay, thank you. So Dr. Kabal again says, okay, 3 aspects plus mutual respect. Is it empathy rather than sympathy?
A question of semantics, I think. Depends on how you would define both of those concepts. The way I talk about empathy and sympathy, think about it as if you were, let's say you're walking down a riverbank and you saw somebody in a boat, and that boat was obviously sinking. That person was in trouble. Empathy would be about appreciating and understanding the challenges that they are in. It is about finding or helping them to find solutions to address that challenge. Sympathy would be getting in the boat with them. They probably feel great, but it's not going to change the situation. You still go down with the boat. It's just they go down with somebody else. But, you know, as I said, it's a question of semantics on how you want to define them. I think we should move on.
Yeah, the questions are coming through. So shall we just move on a little bit and then I'll mention those questions?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So this piece around unconscious bias, let's explore that in a little bit more detail, see where it comes from, what are we talking about. Sorry, trying to click through to a slide. So we know that as human beings, a large portion of our behavior and how we make judgments about other people is done subconsciously. We make tens of thousands of evaluations and judgments about other people every single day. And of course, we don't do that consciously. We do the large majority of that subconsciously. And as Daniel Kahneman said, he's a Nobel Prize winning psychologist who coined the phrase unconscious bias. He talked about the fact that our unconscious is often the secret author of many of the choices and judgments we make on a day-to-day basis. And when we talk about the judgments we make about other people, it starts to illustrate how problematic that can be. Sorry, I'm having trouble with the slides today. There we go. So, first and foremost, we go through life, okay, making judgments about other people, but those judgments are heavily, heavily influenced by our past experiences and therefore our expectations about what we see. Okay, some of you will have seen this image many times before. It's the old classic, keep calm, carry on image. But I'm sure you've already appreciated, as you look at it in more detail, it doesn't make sense. It's not the same old image. Okay, but at first glance, your unconscious will run around in the background, a wonderfully enthusiastic little helper saying, oh, that's the keep calm sign. Right, we've done that. We can move on. I know what that's all about. Okay, but it's not. It's clearly not. And the same goes for people. When we see people for the very first time, we will label them as quickly as possible based on our stereotypical expectations about who they will be. We see what we expect to see. And it's only through closer scrutiny we realize, actually, maybe you're not that stereotypical person I always thought you to be. But without recognizing and having that awareness of some of our unconscious biases, what we run the risk of is just leaping to conclusions, finding patterns that don't necessarily exist. Some of you might be familiar with this very famous image of some cloud formation that was quickly identified or spotted as being a representation of a Spitfire. Not edited, that's exactly how it was taken. Now we know that's not a Spitfire. Anybody who's ever glanced up into, a blue sky with the fluffy clouds rolling over and said to themselves, oh, look, there's an elephant, or there's a tank, or there's a train, or whatever it might be. You know that doesn't exist. But as human beings, we are pattern recognition animals. We have certain expectations about how the world will be, how other people will be, and then we'll try and spot the patterns that just seem to fit, that seem to make sense, that seem to reinforce our prejudgments about other people. But people are infinitely complex. We can't be reduced down to simple models like stereotypes or other gross generalizations. It cannot be done. But at an unconscious level, we love to do it because it simplifies the world and allows us to carry on. It allows us to make quick judgments and then get back on with our day-to-day life. And it's really interesting that we also simultaneously then suffer from what we call functional blindness or inattentional blindness, which is an inability to see information that seems to challenge our expectations, that seems to challenge our stereotypical view or the patterns we've picked up about an individual. What you're looking at here is a CT scan of some lungs used as research several years ago now, where they got radiographers to scan various or to view various CT scans and identify what they were looking at. And about 75% of the group didn't spot the fact that there is a superimposed tiny little gorilla in the top right-hand corner of that image. You may not have even noticed it now. But interestingly, eye tracking technology, so you can literally see where people are focusing their eyes. Those radiographers did look at it, but it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit what you expect to see. So you don't see it, you ignore it. Now, logic would dictate you take that information and you reshape your beliefs about what you're looking at. That's what logic would dictate, but your unconscious goes, nah, forget it. It doesn't work, it doesn't fit. I don't see it. It's not important. And it serves to reinforce and validate our prejudgments, our evaluations, our quick and rough judgments about another person. And I've used the word bias a lot, and I think it's worthwhile defining it at this stage, because we see the world the way we want to see the world. Bias is a very emotive word. It sits alongside words like prejudice and discrimination. But as psychologists, when we talk about bias, what we're talking about is making a cognitive thinking error, driven by expedient modes of thinking, rough rules of thumb, gross generalizations, stereotypical beliefs, and observation of patterns that don't exist. It's basically about an error in judgment. We do not see what the reality actually is. And this can be deeply problematic in a workplace environment, because when we think about making decisions about other people, let's take a simple example, okay? Let's say someone in the audience today is involved in recruitment and selection. You're looking to hire somebody new into your team. You know, and it's been drummed into you for years, that your job is to make a fair, accurate, objective decision about that individual's capability to do the job. That's your job, okay? You know that's what you're there to do. But without an awareness of the biases that are inherent within you, within all of us, I should say, within each and every one of us, we may not recognize the mines in that minefield. We are not in a good place to be able to challenge those biases. So let me paint an example, okay? Let's say, for sake of argument, you're recruiting a consultant into your team, okay? And you receive a CV from me, okay? You get my CV, you like the look of it, it looks good, you think, yeah, okay, I'll interview this person. But before I do so, I'm gonna get them to do a personality questionnaire. You get the output of that personality questionnaire, you read through it before you go into the interview, and you pick up certain, what you believe to be important pieces of information. That I may be quite detail focused, a little bit introvert, you know, I'm good with numbers, super organized, things like that. And immediately this starts to spark certain things in you, certain expectations, certain stereotypes about who I am. Maybe I'm the geek, yeah? Maybe I'm the numbers person, not very good with people. All those stereotypes start to bubble up from beneath the surface. And now all of a sudden, when you meet me for the first time, you don't see me, you see the label that you hung around my neck. And that label gets filtered through a variety of different biases. So for example, you may believe that me as a person, I'm not very similar to you. And we know that we have what's called a similarity bias, a bias in which we are naturally more likely to favor and feel positive towards and connect with people who are similar to ourselves. It's part of our evolutionary heritage, that tribal heritage, if you like, that we have within us. And as a result, you may already be starting to think quite negatively about me. Not my kind of guy, not my person, not going to fit in with the rest of us and the rest of the team. You go through the interview nonetheless, but what do you fall into? The trap of confirmation bias. You go looking for information that confirms why you're right, to believe that I am not right for your team. You go looking for information that confirms your prejudgments rather than taking a bottom-up, data-centric, evaluative and objective approach to making a decision. You may along the way, through the conversation, you may along the way pick up information that seems to buck the trend, that seems to challenge your stereotypical beliefs about me. Do you embrace that? Nah, forget it. It's easier to attribute that to something else. Like I succeeded through luck rather than judgment. That I succeeded not because I'm good at doing this particular thing, but because I was surrounded by an incredibly supportive team who were. It's what we call the attribution bias. I mean, fundamental to all of this, it's very likely I've walked into that situation suffering from what's called the halo horns bias. Okay? Even before I've met you, even before you've even seen my face, okay, you have already put some horns over my head. Everything you see from me is viewed through that slightly negative lens. The flip side is also true. You might love me from the first impression you get from me, and all of a sudden everything I do is gospel, everything I do is great, okay? But nevertheless, whichever way you slice it, if those judgments that you make on me are based in part from the stereotypes and the various filter mechanisms and biases along the way, you have not arrived at an objective conclusion about who I am. You have not appreciated me as the individual that I am. You have, in effect, made a biased judgment. So in a moment, we will move on to perhaps the most important question, which is what do I do about any of that? But I can see Narinda's joined us again, so I'm sure we've got a few questions.
Yes. Okay, so we've got a question. McGregor Smith report, 1 in 8 BME people in the workplace, top management is 1 in 6 BME. Isn't that conscious and not unconscious bias?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. It's a good point. I think it's important to stress here, and I did mention it earlier on, that an appreciation of our unconscious biases is only one of a plethora of blockers to success, particularly for underrepresented groups in organizations. And you're absolutely right to argue that to a large degree, some of the things we do in life are not necessarily unconscious, and it could be argued that's just a nice little get-out clause. Sorry, it wasn't my fault, it was my unconscious. And a way of hiding behind the fact that to a large degree our biases are conscious to us. Things like stereotypes. I've talked about stereotypes already. We have very strong stereotypes about gender, men and women in particular. We have equally strong stereotypes about people from different ethnic backgrounds as well. Those stereotypes are rich They are very value driven. Okay, and those stereotypes are more often than not very conscious to us. For some, they are not, and it is about bringing some of those unconscious biases to the fore. But I absolutely agree with you, and certainly wouldn't challenge the view that to a large degree we still suffer from conscious bias in organisations, certainly.
Okay, thank you, John. Another question. So stereotyping and the desire to construct a like-minded team might also emerge from insecurities as a leader. Oh yeah, definitely. Surround myself with people who look like me, sound like me. They're not quite as good at me as me because, you know, they haven't done it as much as I have. But yeah, absolutely. And it's a form of self-validation. But it's also, it comes back to this similarity bias, this affinity bias, this natural tendency to think, well, people that are like me are going to be better for me. And let's not deny the fact that if you surround yourself with people who are like you, who do think like you, okay, you will create a very harmonious team very quickly. An effective team, probably not. But harmonious, yeah, everybody gets on like a house on fire. But as we'll see later on, in terms of what we call collective intelligence of a team, this is clearly not what you're there to do. Harmony in a team is important, but it is absolutely not the only thing. All right. Sorry, Narinder, some of these slides are moving a bit slow. Okay, so what do we do about all of this? What did we do about all of this? So for me, what I want to share with you now are just some simple, quick illustrations of things that we can do. And they are not the only things, but I hope that these are some interesting takeaways and the things that you can actually do today. It's important to recognize that just raising one's awareness of the existence of bias, conscious or otherwise, doesn't mean they're going anywhere. They don't change necessarily. Okay, they are still there. But we need to challenge both ourselves and the culture if meaningful change is to happen. And when it comes to challenging ourselves, it's important to recognize and realize that we need to continually challenge ourselves both before making a critical people-related decision, during the decision itself, and afterwards. And I'll share with you a few illustrations of how you might do that. So, for example, before the decision, okay, before you're making a critical people-related decision, and this could be the obvious stuff like recruitment and selection, but simultaneously the less obvious stuff. Who do you share this information with? Who do you involve in a particular project? Who do you give that opportunity to present to a senior leadership group and to raise their profile? These are all subtle but critical people-related decisions. And I think it's really important to know your biases in detail, to become on first name terms with them, to become intimate with some of the biases you carry around with you. Accessing those conscious biases that we referenced earlier on is arguably easier, but it does require some introspection on your part. Accessing your unconscious biases is a little bit more difficult. But let me ask you to do something very quickly if I can. If you're comfortable, I'd like you to close your eyes because I want you to visualize something. I really want you to see it in your mind's eye. I want to paint a picture for you. You're sat on a plane, you're about to go on holiday. Obviously it's pre-COVID, but you're sat on a plane, you're looking to go on holiday, you're all relaxed, you're really looking forward to a nice 2-week break. The plane is still on the tarmac, the doors are still open, you're relaxing, you've got G&T in hand, everything's good. And all of a sudden there's massive commotion, okay? Huge commotion going on down the end of the plane. And all of a sudden you see somebody storm onto the plane holding a gun. It's a terrifying situation. They're screaming all around, etc. And you see that person storm into the cockpit. And you can see down the gangway that they are holding a gun to the pilot's head. You can see the pilot. My question to you is, in your mental image right now, is the pilot male? I would imagine for most of you, not all of you, okay, but I imagine for most of you, the pilot is indeed a man. And why not? Makes sense. I think about 93% of commercial airline pilots are indeed men. So it's a good guess. It's a good guess. But unfortunately, our unconscious tends to take illogical leaps from this. So most pilots are men. Fine, I accept that. I'll get on board with that. All pilots are men. Clearly that doesn't hold up to much scrutiny. All pilots should be men. Well, clearly that's problematic.
That's when it's starting to influence your judgments about what makes for a good pilot, that they should be in some way male, that male characteristics in some way make them a better pilot. That is what we call an implicit association, an unconscious association made between the concept of what a pilot is and the concept of what a man is. And we see it time and time again in organizations where we see those links between, for example, the concept of what a woman is and the concept of what a leader is, or the concept of what a man is and what the concept of a leader is. We see those kind of implicit associations simultaneously when it comes to skin color, when it comes to ethnic origin, when it comes to disability. We all have these subtle implicit associations where we've taken these separate mental models about the world and we've bolted them together. And we know based on the research that this type of stuff influences our behavior, that it influences the degree to which we see people from certain populations as being capable in doing certain jobs. And again, that makes no logical sense. But if you were interested in this, you can look at things like the Harvard University's implicit association test. Granted, it does have some issues and some challenges right now, but at the moment, it is a useful way of challenging yourself to look at some of your unconscious biases. It's a hugely important step to take, because if you don't know where your biases are, and you don't know where they are before you are in the heat of a moment of a decision, it is unlikely that you will be able to manage or mitigate the risks associated with them. Because during the decision itself, we need to be mindful of how we get from point A, which is the person sat in front of you, to point B, the objective decision that we want to make about their capability, whether they are good enough. And here we need to build fairness by design. We need to take a structured approach. We need to plan out in advance the roadmap from getting from point A to point B. We need to recognize that certain routes are going to be inefficient and lead to dead ends, and certain routes will get you where you need to be. It's about thinking about, well, how do we define success in an inclusive way? How do we create systems and processes that measure those skills and capabilities and potential in an inclusive, fair, and objective way? How do we make sure that our archetypes of what good looks like in this role, this organization, are not influenced by my own personal stereotypes or more societal stereotypes that shape the way I view the world? Structure and system and process is not unhelpful bureaucracy in this case. It is about enabling you to navigate the minefield more successfully. And finally, after that moment, what do you do to challenge yourself, to uncover and explore the unpleasant truths rather than resting in your comfortable lives? What are you doing to play devil's advocate and ask yourself questions like, okay, I've just made a decision. It's going to impact on somebody's progression or opportunity in this organization with me right now. How did I do it? How did my biases play a role in this? What could I have been doing better? What system or process should I have been doing? Narinder, these slides keep changing order for some reason. So what are you doing to address, okay, and open yourself up to exploring some of those unpleasant truths? And that loops back into the before, okay? It's what creates that virtuous cycle of anticipating the moment, acting within the moment, and reflecting after the moment. Okay. Narinder, I'm struggling to move these slides on.
Okay, you do have the remote control access. Which one are we on?
Okay, it's back. Right, I've got it, thank you. Okay, so challenging oneself, obviously that's key, that's important in terms of driving fair, objective decisions that value difference, that value the individuality of a person, that bust us out of thinking about things in such a closed-minded way, that get us to think about the full potential that difference brings to an organization. But that can only be the first step. We need to challenge the culture itself to embrace that difference once it arrives, to make sure that that difference within organization is seen as a valuable asset, to revisit, if I may, some of the benefits associated with diversity and inclusion. When we I cannot move through these slides, Narinder. Right, thank you. Okay. When we think about that box that's in front of you as being, let's say, the universe of ideas, of options, of activities, of actions that can be taken when you're addressing a particular situation. You've got one person in that team, highly intelligent, highly regarded, but of course logic would dictate they're not going to have a full perspective on the entire problem. They will have limited skill sets, they will have limited experiences, which therefore makes that red circle that's in front of you, it only encompasses a small amount of that problem space. So we recruit more, we get more people in. We talked about this earlier on, recruiting like-minded people. We recruit a team of clones, and we think that's going to solve the problem. Of course it doesn't. What we end up with is this, okay? The very definition of an unintelligent team. Okay, probably very harmonious, everybody gets on like a house on fire. But is it better at doing its job? No, of course not. As a collective unit, it is not effective. Diversity is about bringing in difference. It's about creating a team that looks like this. It's about creating an organization in which people have different viewpoints, different perspectives on the challenges that you're looking to address. However, and this is the rub, this is the challenge, you increase the level of difference in an organization, you increase the opportunity and the risk of social exclusion. You increase the opportunity that those individuals who are perhaps in the minority, are underrepresented in your organization, are not integrated, okay? They are excluded, they are pushed out, or more troublingly, they have to change themselves to become part of the whole unit, and that's even more worrying. But if we focus on those individuals that slowly get pushed out, we know, based on the research, that the top reasons why people leave an organization, in the top 3, is that people do not feel valued, respected, and included. They do not feel part of what's going on. They do not feel like they can be their authentic selves. And it has a marked impact on the success of the organization. But for me, the most interesting thing is that it has a marked impact on the individual. We know, for example, that feelings of social exclusion activate the same parts in our brain that process physical pain. Physical pain, okay? Feeling socially excluded on a regular day-to-day basis is the same as being subject to chronic pain. And you know how damaging that can be, psychologically, physiologically, to society at large, to family, to colleagues, to friends, to co-workers. It is a horrible situation to be in. And driving diversity into your organization without creating an inclusive culture runs the risk of exacerbating these very problems. What I'm asking you to think about is your organization inclusive of that difference? What are you doing on a day-to-day basis to create a culture of inclusion? And I'm challenging you, not your organization, not the people in charge, you. Because all organizations at some point on their website will talk about what culture we have in this organization. And anybody who's ever worked in those organizations will know, well, actually, that's not quite true. It's the informal culture that drives the organization. It's how people talk. It's how people behave. It's how people interact with each other on a day-to-day basis. That is where the culture is derived, not what the leaders at the top say it is. So I'm asking you to think about, in the meetings that you're involved in the teams that you run, in the departments that you're part of, in the organizations that you're part of, what are you doing in your day-to-day behavior to create what's called a psychologically safe working environment? Psychological safety is a core tenet of creating a truly inclusive space. It is a space in which people feel comfortable putting themselves at risk without fear of explicit or implicit punishment because they put themselves out there, because they shared a viewpoint, because they challenged the status quo. I like to think about it as the 3 E's of psychological safety. So firstly, we're talking about engagement. How comfortable are you and how comfortable are your people in engaging with colleagues openly and authentically, sparking critical and constructive debate? Some of you may be familiar with what Pixar call their brain trust. Pixar, the film company, production company behind Toy Story, Monsters, Inc. and so on, obviously hugely successful. Very early on in any project, okay, they implement what they call their brain trust, which is a collection of people from all walks of life, from all different backgrounds, who are brought together in a very safe space and very safe environment to critique the project, to challenge the project, not the person or not the people involved, but to challenge the project, to engage in what we call task-based conflict. Task-based conflict is the origins of innovation and creativity. It's what pushes us forward to the next best thing. So how comfortable are people in your teams, your departments, your group meetings in engaging with colleagues in that open, constructive debate and forum for debate? And of course, building on that, you have to have that culture of safe expression. Can people in your organization routinely challenge, expose risks, point to things that may go wrong despite the fact that everybody else thinks this is great? You think about Lehman Brothers, the organization that collapsed in 2008. Now that was a bank full of incredibly intelligent people. And those people brave enough to point out to senior leadership in particular that the risk profile of this bank was incredibly dangerous. They were fired. It was that simple. They were fired. Would you want to be the next person in line to put your hand up and say, do you know what? I'm not so sure this is a safe bet. I don't think we should be doing this. Of course you don't. Of course you don't. I mean, it's a culture of fear. It's the very definition of fear. The risk to you about expressing your viewpoint is significant. You lose your job. Okay? But that company just marched itself off a cliff. It was that simple. And finally, experimentation. Experimentation, of course, is the origins of innovation. It's what pushes organizations forward. It's what creates and drives change. But experimentation comes with inevitable failure. How is your organization in dealing with failure? How comfortable, confident, open, constructive is it with dealing with failure? Google X, or what's called the moonshot division of Google. It's the part of the organization that basically aims to do the weird, crazy, groundbreaking, world-changing stuff. And of course, they have failure all the time. And you think that, you know, those prototypes they build, or those models they build about this next big thing that never went anywhere, you'd think, right, well, they just gather dust in a corner and nobody ever talks about them. Well, actually, they end up in glass cases in the lobby. They are celebrated failures. They are seen as successful failures because they are seen as opportunities to learn and to grow. Okay? Creating environments like that, that's both simultaneously value difference, but create an environment, a culture that is inclusive of difference, that welcomes and truly values and respects different viewpoints, perspectives, ideas, challenges, options, and opportunities. These are the organizations that maximize the potential afforded by difference. I said it earlier, difference, diversity and inclusion is not a numbers game. It is not a tick box exercise. It is not about just running your statistics and figuring out how many people from different representative groups are found at different layers in your organization. It is much bigger than that. It's about what you do to create an organization where people can genuinely be their authentic self. And it is up to each of us. It is up to every single one of us to do something about that, because we need to appreciate that diversity and inclusion is fundamentally important. It is business critical. Now, personally, I still stand by my statement that it's just the right thing to do. Each and every one of us has a moral imperative to focus in this space, okay? But diversity and inclusion is critical for business success. But, as I said earlier, one particular challenge we need to embrace is us as human beings being the weakest link in this whole thing. That we are all biased, okay? That those biases can be subtle, they can be obvious, they can be conscious, they can be unconscious. But whichever way you slice it, it is those biases that undermine our success, that chip away at any sense of inclusion in your organization, any sense of belonging that people have. But importantly, bias is learned. You know, my son and his friends were not born with this perception that girls should like Frozen and boys shouldn't. They learn that. They learn that from society. They learn it from their parents. They learn it from their friends. But if they're learned, they can be unlearned. Okay? If they are culturally built, we can chip away at that culture. We can challenge them. Okay? But, you know, I suppose my final call to action to us all is that you need to do something about that. Okay? Just spending an hour with me talking about unconscious bias doesn't mean those biases have gone anywhere. They're still there. They're still in the background or in the foreground for some of us. Okay? But what you need to think about is what you do on a day-to-day basis to manage and mitigate your own biases, to manage their impact, to be aware, to challenge them within yourself and challenge them within others, to push the organization and the culture around you to embrace and value the difference for what it is, which is a fantastic opportunity. So on that note, I suppose I'd like to say thank you very much. Obviously, I'm sure we've got a few questions, a few thoughts, a few reflections at this point as well.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Jon. So we've got a question here. So an unconscious bias is by its very nature instinctive. So do you think that the right education and research, we can ultimately change this instinct? I'm often harsh with myself for even thinking the wrong thing before I check myself. But I wonder if the subconscious bias at the level of thought can ever change. Sorry.
So it's worthwhile being careful about language here. So, for example, things like the affinity bias that we've talked about earlier on. This is, I suppose you could argue, it's more a source of bias. When we talk about bias being a cognitive thinking error, it's an inaccuracy in judgment, driven by some of our, in some cases, innately derived characteristics. So affinity bias is argued to be part of our evolution. It's argued to be something where we will naturally gravitate towards people who are like ourselves and away from people who aren't. Okay? Now, to answer that question, therefore, things like that are unlikely to disappear if they are part of our evolution. Certainly not anytime soon, put it that way. Okay? Other biases that we have, or other sources of bias that we have, things like stereotypes, we're not born with those. Those aren't part of our evolution. We build them. We build them as a way of overly simplifying the world around us. So those things can be directly challenged. There's what's called a disconfirmation hypothesis, which broadly put it, means that the more time you spend with role models who challenge the very stereotype you hold about them, the more likely we are to erode that stereotypical belief, for example. This has been shown within studies around ethnicity and skin color in particular. And interestingly, that implicit association test I mentioned earlier on has shown to shift, or showed itself to shift in a more positive, balanced direction when Barack Obama was president of the US. And the reason for that is that there was a very public role model who started challenging those rather insidious stereotypes that Black people, okay, are not as effective, okay, that Black people cannot achieve success, okay. Now, during Barack Obama's tenancy, then that shifted, it changed. I'm not entirely sure what's been happening since Trump's inauguration. I suspect nothing good, but I don't want to get overly political about it. Anyway, the short answer to the question is that some of it we can challenge, some of it we can't, but all of it we can become more aware of. And we have free will. We can control our behavior if we know what drives our behavior. We are better placed to avoid the tendency that our biases turn into prejudice and discrimination. That is where bias becomes real, prejudice and discrimination. That is where it becomes real, and we have the opportunity and the choice to stop it.
Okay, thank you, John. So Jan Overt, hello, John. This important work should, of course, involve all levels of leadership and teams. Is one of the challenges for organisations that it starts at the wrong level or with the roles who are not believable, and in brackets, for lack of or of a better word?
Yeah, absolutely, Jan. Thanks very much. So here, there are several things that we know work incredibly well and things that don't. And I've seen them in many client organizations I've worked with. To your first point, Jan, about starting at a particular level, you're absolutely right. And it has to start at the top, okay? You have to get buy-in, genuine buy-in and commitment from those people that are heavily influential in shaping the culture of an organization. When those people are seen to be the role models for this, that is where you see change happening. That is where you see change happening and filtering down through the organization. I've been in many sessions before where I'm talking to people at, let's say, middle leadership level, and they'll say, this is fantastic, absolutely what we need to talk about right now. Has my boss been through this? No. Is my boss going through this? Well, we're trying, but we haven't succeeded yet. Okay? And you can see them shut down. You can see them go, well, if my boss isn't bothered about it, why should I be? So yes, absolutely, it has to start at the top. I think as well, what we're seeing an increased trend towards is around solidifying diversity and inclusion as a core part of the business rather than an add-on. So, for example, there's been an increased tendency on certainly big organizations these days to have what are now called chief diversity officers. Their sole role and responsibility is around diversity and inclusion in the organization. The flip side I also see is I will talk to somebody and they'll say, yes, I'm responsible for diversity and inclusion in the organization. Oh, that's great, wonderful, that's fantastic. Well, it's not my day job. My day job is I'm head of operations, but I've been asked to do this. Again, it doesn't send out a particularly strong signpost to the rest of the organization that this is to be taken seriously. I mean, if anything, it just shows that, well, technically it's a hobby. It's not really an integral part of the organization. It's just an adjunct. It's a hobby. Sets the wrong scene.
Thank you, John. So Gaurav Khan has got one final question. Do you think stereotypes have a place in our institutions at all?
That's a big question to finish on. Short answer is no. Now, the longer answer obviously is much more difficult to attain, but stereotypes are gross generalizations. They are the reduction of the infinite capacity that makes somebody the individual that they are, down to a few simple rules. I suppose the flip side is, if I were to put the question back on everyone in this group right now and say, okay, would you ever appreciate a decision being made about you, a decision that affects your career, your opportunity, your success in an organization, that was based not on you as an individual, but some rough generalization of you, some cardboard cutout of who you are, to put you in a box to make a decision about you based not on you, but the box that we want to put you in? I would argue not a single person will go, yeah, absolutely, I'd be happy with that. And that, I think, is the answer to the question. Can stereotypes ever be useful, ever be good? Not in a complex environment like the world of work. No, I don't think so.
Okay, great. We're getting a few questions coming through. So Julia Hopkins, can you talk a little bit more about how to create a psychological safe workplace, or recommend some reading around how to do this meaningfully and well?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of psychological safety, it's very interesting that this is one concept that over the last couple of years, I would say, seems to have gained massive traction in organizations. still lingers a bit of misunderstanding about what we're talking about when we talk about psychological safety. But as a concept, it's existed for about 20 years. But certainly over the last few years, I think it's grown in appreciation about how fundamentally important it is. If you're interested to read more about it, there are a number of really valuable texts. One I particularly value is it's a book called The Fearless Organization, by Amy Edmondson. Fearless Organization. It's a really fantastic illustration of the research and the practical application of psychological safety, and there's loads of good stuff within it. To answer your question more broadly, though, what we're looking at in terms of psychological safety, well, let me give you a couple of simple ideas, because psychological safety is a very fluid dynamic. You can feel very psychologically safe in one meeting, and you go to another meeting and you don't. It's incredibly fluid, very individual. You as an individual may feel a huge amount of psychological safety in your organization, but do not for 1 second assume everybody else does too. Okay? It's a very individual characteristic created by the culture that surrounds them within that particular moment. And so therefore, make it real for yourself. Think about the next meeting that you're involved in. Whether you're in charge of that meeting or not, identify, spot the cultural dynamics going on in that meeting. Do you see people routinely seemingly biting their lip, keeping quiet? Do you see a culture whereby alternative ideas are being shut down, where people are being interrupted, and it seems to be the same few people being interrupted every time? Do you notice those little cultural micro behaviors that are chipping away at that culture of psychological safety? And ask yourself what you can do. Ask yourself about, when's the moment when I can literally explicitly say, sorry, earlier on, so-and-so was interrupted, but I love that idea and I want to hear more. Tell me more. Just those little subtle micro affirmations, those little supportive behaviors that make somebody appreciate that, yes, my viewpoint is valued in this meeting right now, and it is to be listened to, and somebody is inviting me to do so. So don't think about it as a big scale thing. Think about it as a day-to-day activity.
Great, thank you, John. So one more question from
Okay.
David Saab. So John, in your experience, does introspection through mindfulness help bring our biases from unconscious to our unconscious minds?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I'll be honest, I'm not as familiar with that line of research, but a few of the headlines I have looked into suggest there is some pretty good support for the view that in engaging in mindful practice at certain key moments, so being very present in the moment, reflecting on the inner dialogue that you're having with yourself at key moments, can be very effective in being able to pinpoint those moments where a bias, unbeknownst to you, seems to have crept into your line of thinking. And therefore, again, you are in a much stronger place to be able to manage the impact of those biases at critical moments. So yes, is the short answer.
Fantastic, thank you, John. Okay, so we're getting some great feedback as well at the same time. So thank you, Gareth and Neil. They've said, thanks, great presentation, very thought-provoking. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening in. As you can see on this slide, John has shared his contact details. So do please connect with John. Email address is there if you've got any more questions, and also link with John on Twitter as well, and LinkedIn as well, John?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. You can find me on LinkedIn.
Okay, fantastic. So yes, thank you for educating us today, John, on driving diversity and inclusion. So it's a very interesting topic that you've actually delivered today, and you've touched on some very important key areas. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Maria.
You're welcome. Okay, just moving over to the next slide. So this is a chamber slide. This is the Thames Valley Chamber of Commerce membership model. So it shows how each tier is designed to attract a business depending on the level of exposure they wish to gain, as well as savings that can be made. So to learn more about our membership model, as a non-member, you can visit our website. So I've put the website address there on the right-hand side in the corner. So please do visit for more information. So the Thames Valley Chamber has created and launched a business continuity toolkit, which is aimed at ensuring that you've got access to a single portal. So this is a portal or a hub designed for any guidance or information that you need around COVID. So there's lots of interesting and useful links in there for any information that you may need to support your business. So please do visit that. Again, that's on the Chamber website on the homepage. Contact details for myself and also Jon are here again. So if you'd like to contact myself about any queries related to membership, then you can do so. And also, please do, as I've mentioned, connect with Jon, send him any questions that you've got, and he will answer those for you. So thank you once again, Jon, for today's webinar. It has been recorded. It's available probably from tomorrow morning on the Chamber webinar library, and also we'll put it up on our LinkedIn page as well, so you can listen to it again and share the link amongst your network. So that's great. It's been very productive, and we've had some, lots of questions coming today, so that's been great. And I'll send some feedback over to you, Jon. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you to everyone.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.